Hi again, everybody. This is Mark Mofsesi, and I'm the co-director of the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's, and I'm joined by the center's other co-director, Mark DiGirolami, for another episode of Legal Spirits, which is our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on our website, lawandreligionforum.org. That's one word, lawandreligionforum.org. And you can also find it on Apple iTunes and the Google site, and actually now on Spotify and a lot of other sites as well. Normally on Legal Spirits, we talk about contemporary issues, and there certainly are a lot of contemporary issues to discuss. But in this episode, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to look backwards, a long way back, about 400 years back, because we'd like to, in this episode, talk about Shakespeare's great play, The Merchant of Venice, and specifically the legal themes in The Merchant of Venice. And the immediate impetus for this is the fact that we had our center's reading group meet last week, and we discussed this play, and the students and alums who came had really great interventions and comments. And so Mark and I thought maybe we should record some of these and share them with our audience.
Yeah, it was a wonderful event, and this is part of our ongoing reading society at the Center for Law and Religion for St. John's students. We've done Antigone, we've done City of God, now Merchant of Venice, and we've got other great programs, great pieces of literature, and other pieces of writing involving law and religion coming up in the semesters, in next semester and the semesters that follow. So it's been a great success, and we thought we would bring some of this to a broader audience.
Yes, Mark, it has been a great success. It's really been a wonderful experience having this reading group. I'm glad we have it now. Well, Merchant of Venice is probably the play that most lawyers would name if you ask them to identify what is Shakespeare's great play about law.
In fact, yeah, I did a Twitter poll, one of these very scientifically accurate Twitter polls, asking which is the greatest play about law that Shakespeare wrote, and the candidates were Measure for Measure, Merchant of Venice, King John, which is a perhaps somewhat lesser known play, or something else. And I think Merchant of Venice came out on top. Mark, I think that was the final count with 30 some odd votes.
Well, Mark, lawyers are fascinated by this play. There are symposia dedicated to this every now and then. Every few years, there's a high-level moot court involving a Supreme Court justice where they try this case again, and courts cite the case repeatedly. So lawyers are really fascinated. And although there are a lot of themes in Merchant of Venice, law is a big one. So it's certainly appropriate to talk about it. As I think we'll explore in this podcast, the irony is that as a legal matter, the play is preposterous. I mean, the central legal debate that sets the whole plot in motion is absurd, as we'll talk about. And of course, there are also a lot of ugly things in the play. I mean, we don't want to minimize that. There's a lot of language that would today be considered offensive and ugly. But it's a very important play nonetheless because of these legal themes and notwithstanding the absurdity of the legal device in the plot. We'll talk about that, and we'll maybe reflect a little bit about what it says about our current state in America today. Okay, I think most people know the play, but let me just start off with a little bit of a plot refresher. So at the beginning of the play, Bassanio, who is a Venetian, wants to woo the fabulously wealthy Portia, who lives in Belmont. But Bassanio doesn't have money, and he doesn't have credit. And so he asks his friend Antonio to borrow money for him from the Jewish moneylender Shylock. And Antonio and Shylock hate each other, right? I think that's fair to say, Mark.
Oh yeah, for sure. They don't like one another at all for a variety of reasons. Some kind of obvious reasons. Antonio has mistreated and humiliated Shylock, but also some reasons that kind of go to the deeper themes I think that we're going to be discussing, which is that Antonio has rescued debtors from Shylock's from debt to Shylock, and therefore has hurt Shylock's business. Right, Shylock has not been able to collect as much as he would have been able to collect without that help. And Antonio hates Shylock. Also, again, the easy answer about why is just because of the anti-Semitism that was prevalent at the time, and that Antonio also shares in. But he also hates Shylock because Shylock charges money at interest on his loans, which is sinful in Christian understanding. So maybe, Mark, let's take a moment and talk a little bit about usury, right? The sin of usury. You want to say a little bit about that?
Yes, because that's central to the play. I mean, as you say, one of the reasons Antonio is so contemptuous of Shylock is that Shylock charges interest on loans, which Antonio, as a Christian, says that he condemns. Now, this is the first of the absurdities in the play, which is, I went back and I read Harold Berman's Law and Revolution, and I was correct in what I remembered and what I said at the reading group, which is by Shakespeare's time, both canon law and the law merchant allowed the charging of interest on loans. Usury was considered the charging of excessive interest. That was the sin. So the first kind of absurdity here is the idea that Christians would be objecting on religious grounds to interest at this time.
Right. No, I think that's true. Anytime you rely on a weasel word like excessive, you get to a situation like what we have today with payday loans and so on, right? That those seem to be okay too. But yes, I think it's probably true. Even though it is interesting, I think that in all these major and all the, or at least many of the major religious traditions, usury as a practice, at least the excessiveness of usury as a practice, was condemned, which is, and that's true in Judaism as well. Not with respect to the issue of excessiveness, apparently, but with respect to whether it's appropriate to lend it interest to members within the tribe versus people outside the tribe. And in Deuteronomy, actually, there's a distinction between what's appropriate for fellow Jews versus what's appropriate for Gentiles, where usury was permitted.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in that. I can't say about that, but I can say that this basic conflict in the play between the Christian who says, I cannot charge interest, it's a sin, and the Jew who says, I can charge interest. There's actually a really interesting discussion in the play where Shylock tries to justify this. That's not really a debate that's any longer going on by Shakespeare's time, at least according to Berman. Okay, so Shylock lends money to Antonio, but the terms are sort of strange. The terms are that if Antonio cannot pay the money, then Shylock will be entitled to a pound of Antonio's flesh. And Shylock says, this is just a merry sport, right? Well, as when the time comes, Antonio cannot pay, and Shylock insists on his bond. He insists on enforcing this agreement. And this places the Venetian state in a difficult spot, right, Mark? Because Venice has people from all over the world who come to trade there. And the way the play is set up, the conceit of the play is that all these traders are in Venice because Venice enforces contracts. And if Venice doesn't enforce this contract, abominable as it is, they will all leave and Venice will lose status and money. So Venice is in kind of a tight spot.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark. In reading the play, again, it struck me that the play is less about law in the sense of, for example, what contract law is all about, than about political theory or even perhaps jurisprudential theory, in the sense of, what it is that grounds or binds a particular society. And you're right to say that in Venice, and as I say, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. In Venice, it was law, contract law, the law of merchants, and the relations among merchants that was really the source of unity, right? The source of what bound people together, not some of these other things, which again also kind of explains in an interesting way the hatred, the mutual hatred of Antonio and Shylock, because again, it's not just a pure sort of religious hatred, it's a hatred with respect in the context of the baseline set by Venice about what people could and couldn't do and how they could and couldn't succeed in the context of Venetian political mores and so on. So that,
Right. And
yeah, please.
no, right, Mark, I'm sorry. And I was going to say, there's a name for this. This is called the do commerce thesis. It is that really you can bring people together from various different cultures and incompatible worldviews as long as you limit their interaction to commerce. As long as the state enforces contracts, people will trade with each other, they will cooperate with each other, they will not push their worldviews. Our friend Nate Ullman has written a whole book about this, which is quite interesting. That was the theory here. And this is why Venice is in such a tight spot, because everything turns on the state enforcing contracts. Okay, so we get to the very climactic court hearing. Shylock comes, he insists on his bond. Portia, who is disguised as a young lawyer named Balthazar, comes in and she resolves the case. She says to Shylock, "You should be merciful." And Shylock says, "No, I insist on my contract." And then she springs her trap. She says, "Okay, you can have what your contract calls for, but only what your contract calls for, and not a drop of blood. And by the way, since you as an alien have threatened the life of a Venetian citizen, there's another law which says that you are now subject to the death penalty and your goods will be confiscated."
It's interesting, and even in between those two options, right? A, you should be merciful, and of course Shylock doesn't want to be merciful. But B, she says, because there had been an offer that he could be paid triple the amount that he was otherwise owed, if he agreed not to insist on the pound of flesh. So in that sense, he was, his own self interest was being appealed to. So and that in some ways was the grosser violation, right? In other words, well, according to the laws or the mores of Venice, that ought to have been more attractive to him, right? You're going to make a
Mhm.
bigger profit than you otherwise would, and still he refuses. He insists on what the law, quote unquote, entitles him to, and that's when, as you say, she springs the trap, which is
Springs the trap.
yeah.
Now, okay, so I said in the beginning this is all based on an absurdity, and I want to, highlight that now. So, the first absurdity here is that Shylock's contract is enforceable. In fact, it would have been void from the beginning as against public order. The law at the time and the law today had this concept of, contracts couldn't be enforced against public order. They couldn't be enforced against good faith, and this would certainly have been thrown out. This whole dilemma that Venice is facing is a phony one, as is also Portia's argument, because assuming this contract were enforceable, then it would naturally entitle Shylock to whatever was incidental to its performance, and certainly a drop of blood is incidental to cutting a pound of flesh. So he would have been entitled to that. This whole thing is a trick. Don't you think, Mark?
Well, yeah, it's nice to have a contracts law professor being the one that's analyzing all of these issues, right? Because you get insight, from within the system about why this particular contract would have been enforced. But I suppose Shakespeare knew this, Mark. Is that your view? He's probably knew what was going on here. It's not like he was ignorant about the law. Yeah.
I think so. No, his other plays show he had a real knowledge of the law. And by the way, there's yet another reason, a third reason, which is you might have said this was not an agreement that contemplated legal enforcement. It was just kind of a joke, as Shylock initially tells Antonio. Okay, so Shakespeare surely knew all this. So why did he do this? And I think, as we discussed in our reading group, and some of the students talked about this, Shakespeare has bigger fish to fry. He's not really interested in the legal conflict here. He's interested in what this conflict represents about actually a very old theological debate, and also about the limits of tolerance in a liberal society. So the first one, look, Shakespeare knew very little about Judaism. Apparently, he had never met a Jew, and he presents a caricature of Judaism. So, and he's taking sides in a very old debate, the old debate between these two great religions, Christianity and Judaism. Christians have always said from the beginning, from the New Testament times, that their religion is a religion of grace, as opposed to Judaism, which in the Christian telling is a religion based on righteousness under God's law. And the Christian theory is such righteousness is just not possible, and we are saved through the mercy, the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and therefore Christians need to show mercy to others. Now, as I say, this is a caricature of Judaism, which also cares about mercy. It's a caricature of Christianity, which also cares about law. But Shakespeare is highlighting these differences, I think. He has a dramatic reason for doing so.
Right, and right as you say. So Shylock, on the other end, as a kind of archetype, right? I mean, you could say it's just as much a caricature of Judaism as it is a caricature of law, right? That obey the law, perform what you promise. Well, of course, we know, lawyers know that contract, pacta sunt servanda, right? Contracts must be enforced. Well, that's a maxim, and it's an important one, but of course there are exceptions, and in practice, it isn't quite so hard edged. But some ways it's in the reason I say it's a jurisprudential play also it's because in jurisprudence these ideas about formalism versus realism, again, these are archetypes or sort of ideal types about what the law is. And even though, yes, there are exceptions and so on, I think it is interesting and useful to sort of reflect on the overarching model or type because each one does have its merits.
Absolutely.
And, Shylock stands for the idea of justice, obey the law, perform what you promise, enforce bargains freely made. And we read, as you mentioned, this essay by Alan Bloom, where Bloom says, "Look, Shylock doesn't cheat anybody. He's not acting in some ways, like an unscrupulous person." Bloom says, "Quote: What he does is neither noble nor generous, but it is not unjust." In some ways, it's about the limits of justice conceived in this way. In
Yes,
some
I agree
ways.
with that, Mark. And I think we have to assume that Shakespeare understood that too. He is, as I say, he is exaggerating the differences between these two approaches, the Christian quote unquote grace approach and the Judaic quote unquote law approach. He's exaggerating it. Maybe because he didn't understand Judaism, maybe because as a Christian he has a bias. He's presenting the Christian view of this thing, but also because he has bigger points to make.
Yeah, and I should mention, we've been talking contract law, but these ideas about revenge, for example, revenge as a part of justice, well, they permeate other areas of law too, like criminal law. There are important theories of criminal punishment that emphasize revenge or a kind of revenge, the sort of equalization of the victim to the one who offends against the victim's dignity, let's say, expressivist theories of criminal punishment. So revenge on this view is a kind of justice, goes back to Romans in some ways, right? Christians have mistreated and they've humiliated Shylock. They've seduced his daughter. If Shylock just sort of forgives in that context, well, then he's going to be despised and hated even more, which is another point that
Right.
Bloom
Now, just to
makes.
clarify, when you say it goes back to Romans, you don't mean the book of Romans, right? You mean to the Romans of the Roman Empire.
No, actually, I do mean
Oh,
Romans. I mean the book of Romans. So the idea of justice and what belongs to God's justice in terms of as a sort of matter of retribution. I do mean the book of Romans. So there are Romans has the most extensive discussion, I think, in all of the Bible. I think, or at least one of the most extensive, about the nature of punishment and what belongs to God's part and what belongs to the part of the king or the part of the secular
okay, that's
authority.
interesting because I was thinking of Romans for the other point that we were making earlier, which is religion of grace as opposed to religion of law, right?
It works there
That it works
too.
there too, yeah. That it is impossible to be righteous by obeying God's law. It's simply impossible, and so you need to have mercy. And that, as I say now, those distinctions may not be so great in practice between these two religions. They surely are not, but this is something that Shakespeare is amplifying. And so why? What's the point he wants to make? And Mark, here I think is where the Alan Bloom essay was really helpful.
No, I agree with that. I think as we've said before, right? For Elizabethans, Venice represented tolerance, right? The most tolerant city in the world, and most tolerant city in a world of great religious intolerance.
And
Um,
why, Mark?
you
Why
know,
was it considered so tolerant?
Well, for precisely the reasons that we had talked about with respect to the issue of commerce, right? So the quote that we have here from Bloom is, quote, "In this city, those men who it was generally thought could never share a common way of life seem to live together in harmony," close quote, right? The Venice was known as La Serenissima, right? The most serene city. Why was it serene? Um, because a new way of being together, a way fostered by commerce, a shared commitment to self-interest, allowed people of very different backgrounds to come together, to live together, to trade in the same currency, right? And that could be understood either technically or in a broader sense. Without getting into fights with one another about deeper issues. Those deeper issues could kind of be suppressed or put down or ignore in the public life, the public political life of the
Right.
city.
And so I think that, and I get this from Bloom, I think what Shakespeare is doing in exaggerating this conflict between Shylock and Antonio is asking the question, well, does the theory on which the Venetian state is basing its tolerance, does it work when the divisions are serious enough? And I think, Mark, Shakespeare's answer seems to be no.
Well, that's right, and Bloom seems pessimistic also, right? So in this sense, as an interpreter of Shakespeare, you know, the view might be respect for the law, the fulfilling of contracts. Um, that can work when you have some kind of at least modicum of baseline of shared assumptions and so on. But when you really get conflict about these deeper questions, as in the case of Shylock and Antonio, it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough. And there, only a kind of deeper set of common values or outlooks or moral views or heritage or traditions can support a community. So this, Mark, gets a little bit actually to some of our own projects with respect to our tradition project, for example, where we thought about these kinds of questions as well.
Yeah, no, that's true. And both you and I have written about this. I mean, to come back to the point we were talking about at the beginning, I mean, lawyers love this play. Why are lawyers so preoccupied with the Merchant of Venice? And I think one answer might be it's because it shows the limits of our profession. It shows the limits of law. And when you have a debate or you have a conflict between groups with rival and incompatible worldviews, and those conflicts are deep enough, you cannot expect that law is going to be able to solve them. In the end, one of the worldviews is going to prevail, and it's going to be the majority's worldview, even if that takes an obvious trick like Portia plays in this case. I think that's the kind of pessimistic lesson that is being taught us here. And I wonder if that isn't really why lawyers have found this play so fascinating. It shows us our limits, really.
So that might be one possibility. It shows us our limits, but it might also be that they're fascinated with it because law has kind of been a replacement morality when common funds of morality have been stripped away, particularly religious funds and other sorts of baselines. And when that happens, law is all that's left. And so the question is, I mean, in some ways, it's similar to the point that you're making, but lawyers always, especially in the United States, it's lawyers that are the public intellectuals. It's lawyers on which the public's word, sort of ears. They are the public is waiting with bated breath for what lawyers have to say, judges have to say, and
Yeah,
so
well,
on. Um,
Tocqueville said lawyers are America's aristocracy.
exactly, because why? Because we've destroyed all other aristocratic sources of sort of authority or morality and so on. And so it's almost like an inevitability that some other class will will sort of take the reins, let's say, or will assume that role. And I do think for us, it has been law. Whether law is able to actually to perform that function, or whether particular moral propositions are kind of smuggled in and enforced through law, is I think another possibility with respect to why lawyers find this play
Yeah, well, I got
fascinating.
to think a little more, Mark, about your pro Bourbon ideology here. I got to think a little bit more
I,
about that.
I didn't say that it was wrong for America to destroy other aristocracies, but some aristocracy there will be,
Yeah,
right?
I understand.
Some group is gonna assume that kind of role, masked as it might be, right? Masked in the clothing of some neutral proposition and so on. But and here I think it's undeniable that lawyers and law has this kind of status as a common moral denominator
Yeah.
for American
Well, that is very
society.
interesting, Mark. Mark, just before we close, I do want to say a couple things about contemporary implications, because I think another reason why people are fascinated with Merchant may be that it makes us a little uncomfortable about our own time. We're living in a very polarized moment in America, in which people have very, very different worldviews and commitments, and we've always counted on law to be, as you were saying, the neutral arbiter that is going to, or if not neutral, law is going to be the value-laden arbiter that is going to handle all this for us. And you look at a lot of cases in the Supreme Court lately in the area in which we work, law and religion, and you see real conflict and a kind of absence of common commitment to values. And so maybe Merchant of Venice should also make us a little bit worried about what's going to go on in our country as we have these deep social divisions.
Yeah, no, it's a good point because I think Merchant and certainly Venice, you and I have talked about, how fun it would be to do a project comparing the late Venetian Republic with the American
Yes,
Republic. Oftentimes,
especially if we do on-site research.
well, I think that would be very important, right? Archival on-site research, absolutely right. Um, but the point is not only about the United States and what's happening here, but perhaps about liberalism. Liberalism also, certainly classical liberalism, follows a kind of strategy, as Venice did in its way, on mutual self-interest to keep people together, checking passions and so on. And the principal one of those passions that has to be kind of tamped down or not allowed to kind of bubble up is religion. And so there are, I think, strong connections here with respect to what Shakespeare writes about Venice to thinkers that are considered, really important foundational American thought, like James Madison. If you think about Madison's Federalist 10, where Madison talks about people's zeal for different opinions concerning religion as this is bad, this is faction, right? That this is a prototypical kind of faction that had to be kind of muted or tamped down as one of the common political affections that won't matter in America. And here, this is going to be a different sort of political community, and it might be that what we're seeing is various pressures that are coming to bear on some of the assumptions that keep republics like Venice, like the United States together, that they may start to erode over time for a variety
Yeah,
of
or maybe
reasons.
they were eroding from the beginning. It may be that Americans were telling ourselves a story about this, and there were many people who were not included and did not feel like they were being treated fairly and that they were being allowed to participate, who were not being treated fairly and allowed to participate. And so maybe it's not so much that things are changing. Maybe this was kind of always there, but suppressed, and it's no longer suppressed. And so, well, is law going to save us now? The message of this play is kind of pessimistic about that, I think.
I agree. I agree, and I agree also with the point that you just made that these are kind of fictions that we tell ourselves, or fictions that those in power tell themselves. This is sort of a legal crit sort of point that we're
Mm-hmm.
making a little bit here, but I think there's a lot to it, and more recent events seem to be supporting that kind of point more than they are sort of evidence
Yeah,
against it.
we plugged our friend Nate Oman's book before. We should, on this point, plug our friend Stephen Smith's new book about the legal fictions that have supported America, which may no longer do so, which may no longer support America. I guess I'll put it that way. Okay, well, so that's a pessimistic note. We don't always end on a pessimistic note, but we have this time. But we'll be more optimistic in future podcasts. For now, this has been Mark Movsesian and Mark DeGirolami, the co-directors of the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's, with another episode of Legal Spirits. You can find past episodes archived on our website, lawandreligionforum.org, also on Apple iTunes and Spotify and Pandora and Google and lots of other streaming platforms. Okay, that's all for now. See you next time.